Start. The threats are. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. Answer to this puzzle is King to e5, King to e3, a5. Next puzzle, let us look at threats in puzzle position. Bishop takes pawn, check. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Queen takes knight. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Checks in this position are. Bishop takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is Queen takes pawn, d5. Bishop takes pawn. Let us go to the next puzzle. The threats are King takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. h4. King to e7. King to c5. King to e6. King to c6. a5. King to c5. Next, the threats are Queen takes pawn, check. Knight takes pawn. Rook takes bishop, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Checks in puzzle position are Queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes bishop, check. Rook takes pawn, check. The best move in puzzle position is Knight takes pawn. Pawn takes knight. Bishop to e3. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Another one. The threats are. There are no threats in this position. Checks in puzzle position are Knight to e5, check. Knight to a5, check. The best move in puzzle position is Knight to e5, check. King to b5. Knight takes queen. c6. Knight to f6. c7. Knight to e8. Let's see the next puzzle. Here are the threats. Pawn takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. f6. Another one. Here are threats in puzzle position. King takes knight. Pawn takes bishop. Bishop takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes knight. Here are the checks. Queen to e5, check. Answer to this puzzle is pawn takes bishop. Knight to b5. Pawn takes knight. Another puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are rook takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes knight. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Bishop to d2, check. Knight to d3, check. Answer to this puzzle is e3. Queen to f3. Rook takes pawn. Queen to g4. Knight to d3, check. Let's continue. Here are the threats. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The puzzle is solved using King to e2. Rook to e8. Queen to e4. Knight to d4, check. Pawn takes knight. Pawn takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. One more. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes bishop. The checks are rook to d8, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook to c1. Rook to c5. Bishop to d4. Bishop takes bishop. Bishop takes rook. Let's see the next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, check. Checks in puzzle position are f5, check. Queen to f5, check. Queen to g6, check. Queen to f3, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to e2, check. Queen to d1, check. The answer is Queen to e2, check. King to g5. Queen takes pawn, check. Let's continue. Here are the threats. Bishop takes knight, check. Here are the checks. Bishop takes knight, check. The answer is rook to e7. Knight to f5. Rook takes bishop. Let's see the next puzzle. Threats in this position are knight takes pawn. The checks are rook to e1, check. Queen to d4, check. Answer to this puzzle is rook to e2. Queen to c3. d2. Rook to d1. Knight to e3. Rook takes pawn. Queen takes rook. Queen takes queen. Rook takes queen. Another puzzle. The threats are bishop takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. The checks are knight to e7, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The answer is bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes bishop. Knight to h6, check. King to f8. Knight takes queen. One more. Threats in this position are: rook takes bishop. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is: bishop to a6. Rook to c1. Rook to b4. Rook to a1. Bishop takes rook, check. King to g1. Rook to a8. One more. Here are threats in puzzle position: queen takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are: queen to b2, check. Queen to b1, check. The answer is: queen to b1, check. King to d2. Queen to b2, check. Another puzzle. The threats are: queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes bishop. Checks in puzzle position are: queen takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is: rook takes bishop. Queen takes rook. King to f1. King to d8. Queen to h6. Rook to g8. Queen to b6, check. King to e7. Queen to f6, check. Next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are: rook takes pawn, check. The checks are: rook takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is: rook to a8. g4. Pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. f6. Rook to h5, check. King to g6. Let us go to the next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are: king takes rook. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle: king takes rook. King to d8. h5. f5. Pawn takes pawn. Another one. The threats are: pawn takes rook. King takes rook. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is: king takes rook. King to f4. King to g6. g5. h5. Let's see the next puzzle. Threats in this position are: pawn takes rook. Queen takes rook, check. Queen takes queen. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Bishop to g7, check. Bishop to f8, check. Bishop to g5, check. Bishop to f4, check. Bishop to e3, check. Bishop to d2, check. Bishop to c1, check. Queen to g6, check. Queen takes rook, check. Queen to f5, check. Answer to this puzzle is: bishop to g5, check. King to g8. Queen takes rook, checkmate. Next, let us look at threats in puzzle position. Pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes rook. King takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen to f5, check. Answer to this puzzle is: pawn takes rook. Queen takes pawn. Queen to f5, check. Next, threats in puzzle position are: queen takes pawn. Queen takes knight. Rook takes pawn, check. Bishop takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen to h7, check. Rook takes pawn, check. The best move in puzzle position is: bishop takes pawn. Pawn takes bishop. Rook takes pawn, check. King to g7. Rook to h7, check. King to f8. Queen to c8, check. King to e7. Queen takes rook. Rook takes rook. Queen takes rook, check. Let's see the next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes rook. The checks are: queen takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Bishop to c3. Rook takes bishop. Pawn takes rook. Another one. The threats are: rook takes pawn. Queen takes queen. There are no checks in this position. The answer is: queen takes queen. Rook takes queen. Rook takes pawn. Knight to e2. Rook takes knight. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.